Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Professor Guardiano. If you don't know me, I'm in the philosophy department and at the Special Collections Research Center of Morris Library. We have today a nice presentation by Dr. Kimberly Harris. She is assistant professor from the University of Virginia. Dr. Harris received a Alwin C. Carus research grant from the Special Collections Research Center and has been around of late doing research there on a project of hers that she is going to be presenting on today. I'm not going to get into too much of Dr. Harris's background because I want to just hand it over to her, but she has been publishing lately on Du Bois. She released a book called The Truth of Race, the philosophical thought of W.E.B. Du Bois. And she's also currently co-editing W.E.B. Du Bois, The Political Economy of Race. That's going to be published by Oxford University Press. And there are other articles that she's published on Du Bois. And I think today we'll be hearing about Du Bois. Her project at the archive has been focused on a book chapter for a new book that she's working on that's focused on Du Bois's aesthetics in relationship to pragmatist aesthetics, in particular, John Dewey. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Harris.
I wanted to start out by thanking everyone at the Special Collections Library and here at the Dewey Center and everyone I've met since I've been around in Illinois. It's been quite an adventure. So, uh, I am, yeah, as Nick was saying, I'm working on a book on Du Bois, and the book is on the book is called The Truth of Race, the philosophical thought of W.E.B. Du Bois. And so this chapter is about pragmatist aesthetics. And I took the opportunity to think about Du Bois's data portraits from the 1900 Paris Exposition. So we're going to talk about those. But I wanted to sort of give you guys a little bit of lay of the land, the big ideas that I'm working with on the book project and why I would be thinking about pragmatist aesthetics. As I was working on the book, I was primarily trained in German idealism in 19th century. I wrote my dissertation on Hegel and Black figures' reception of Hegel, and Du Bois was one of those figures. And so I've always been inclined to look at early Du Bois. Some people will point out that's the more conservative Du Bois, and that's absolutely true. But in some ways, at that time, that was the most philosophically interesting Du Bois. But as I've kind of evolved as I've been working on the book project. The influence of pragmatism is so strong on Du Bois, and what I realize is that the main thesis of the book is working out what kind of pragmatist Du Bois is, and so I'm dealing with the pantheon of pragmatist thinkers. I've done a little bit of work already on Du Bois and Royce, and Du Bois and Peirce, and Du Bois, of course, teacher William James. And so naturally, eventually, now I've gotten to Dewey, and I have to say that I like Dewey a lot. And so one of the anchoring ideas of a theory of truth, Du Bois's theory of truth that I've been working out, is that Du Bois has this pragmatist theory of truth. And I'm looking at two strands of it, and one is this what I was calling I have been started calling a Jamesian practical strand. I got that language from Hilary Putnam, actually. And I'm also looking at what I'm calling a Deweyan utilitarian strand. And what I found is that Du Bois is, you can trace these two strands through his theory of truth, but he still ends up arguing against these kinds of views because he hangs on to this absolute view of truth. And so he's got a unique theory, and I've been trying to work that out. And one of the avenues I've been trying to work it out is through these aesthetics. And Dewey's been great to look at with aesthetics. Since I've been here, I should tell you, I am officially a person who knows how to do archival work now that I've done it 2 times. But what I've discovered about archival work is that you come up with this list of things you think you want to look at, and you think you're going to find something there, and then you end up all over the place. And that's the fun part about it. And Dewey's been a great thinker to kind of look through his archive, because he writes so many drafts of things. If students are here, you're probably thinking, yeah, yes, you got to rewrite everything. But Dewey seems to be a person who rewrote a lot, and some of his revisions are really interesting. Now, as far as Dewey's aesthetics, of course, art as experience is going to be the thing that comes to mind first for lots of people, and we can certainly have a conversation about that. But what I was more interested in, or more specifically interested in with Dewey, is what I put in the title of the talk today, is this broad idea of social imagination that comes out of Dewey. And it has such a great affinity to Du Bois, because Du Bois in some ways turns away from philosophy. I say that in scare quotes, because he doesn't leave philosophy behind, but he says, I want to go and study social theory. And in terms of those, comparing Dewey to those other pragmatists that I was just mentioning that I've already looked at more closely, Du Bois, in terms of social theory, seems to have so much more in common with Dewey. But you might be thinking, well, Dewey doesn't really have a theory of truth. And some people might say, to talk about a pragmatist theory of truth in general with regards to pragmatism seems to be a little bit at odds. And that's a tension that I'm working through. But so this idea of social imagination, thinking about Dewey as a social theorist, and the kind of conception of truth that we can extract there. And Du Bois does have some differences from Dewey. The biggest difference, as I was just sort of indicating already, is that he still, from his student days, retains this sense that there's an absolute truth out there in the world where we might not be able to grasp it. He thinks the inquiry of science is supposed to be getting us closer to it, but it's not something that we ever reach. And it's not a Roycean affinity that he has, because Royce too has this sense of absolutism. Royce is not a Roycean in that way. And so if you want to be thinking, right, if we want to say something unique about Du Bois's theory of truth, I would focus here on this idea that he has this idea of absolute truth, and that it's different to his teacher William James in its practical sense. He's concerned with communities. That brings him closer to Dewey. And he's different than Dewey because he isn't going to downplay the, I don't want to say downplay the importance of truth, but this idea that there is a truth out there in the world, and that we're supposed to be getting closer to it, but we might not ever quite capture it, is the big ideas there. Okay, so the main connection, I should say, between Du Bois and Dewey, recall that I'm using Dewey in some ways as a foil. I'm
Let
using
me see if let me see. I'm sure everyone is
the
muted.
owl is speaking.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm using Dewey as a foil for Du Bois. They don't have any interaction with each other. They are contemporaries. The two connections that matter is Du Bois reached out to Dewey several times to write, primarily in his capacity as editor of the Crisis, to write for the Crisis. On issues around racial justice. And from what we can tell, Dewey never responded. So he never got around to that. And then the second is that Dewey gives a address to the NAACP in 1932, and he talks about racial prejudice and racial friction. So the kind of highlight to think about there is it's a really interesting address because he ends up talking about the economic foundations of racial friction. So the talk about race as a biological myth and the kind of spillover from the 19th century discussions about race that were mostly concerned around biology and those kinds of scientific questions. Of course, Dewey is thinking about them more in social terms, and of course, that is going to be attractive for Du Bois. The other interesting kind of little nuggets that I took away from looking at Dewey's discussion of racial prejudice and friction is uh, maybe it's this is, I had to turn the news. I've had to turn the news off because it's just, our political world is crazy. But Dewey would have some really interesting things to say because he focused a lot, weirdly, in the piece or at different points on trade with Asian nations. So I was looking at that and I was thinking, Anyways, so those are the way we can think about the direct relationship between Dewey and Du Bois. So I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about those data portraits. The book chapter that I'm working on at the moment is called Beauty as Method, and it deals equally with art and science. And I'm thinking about beauty in both art and science. Beauty is considered secondary or a matter of taste or ornament or mere rhetorical appeal. For Du Bois, however, beauty was never optional. It was a method of inquiry, a mode of resistance, and a framework for understanding. So he's writing within the racialized constraints of the late 19th, early of 20th century America, and he was advancing a radical proposition that beauty is not merely an aesthetic preference, but a necessity. And I'm thinking here in particular of his 1926 paper, Criteria of Negro Art, where he claims, and this is the big, quote that I'm deciphering to think about his aesthetic epistemology and Dewey's social imagination. He says, beauty sits above truth and right. So, meaning that beauty is essential to the pursuit of knowledge and justice. Ultimately, I'm arguing that Du Bois's theory of beauty bridges science and ethics, cognition and justice, and he's challenging the idea that aesthetics is ancillary to knowledge or politics. I'm proposing that beauty is what makes truth knowable, moral life bearable, and liberation imaginable. And this view challenges prevailing norms in scientific reasoning and aesthetic theory. Aesthetic values such as simplicity or coherence or elegance are not indicators of truth, but tools for understanding. Du Bois anticipates and deepens these insights, extending them from uh, natural sciences to social science. So his vision frames beauty as a situated, purposeful mode of meaning making that responds to the ethical and cognitive demands of social life. And I'm exploring Du Bois's concept of beauty as both an epistemic and moral idea, and I'm tracing it, at least tracing how it shapes his contribution to Black aesthetics and epistemic democracy. And Dewey's ideas, democratic thinking, of course, has been really important for thinking about. Du Bois makes a really famous claim in Criteria of Negro outside of the claim that beauty sits above truth and right, which is all art is propaganda. And this is a inflammatory statement, but I think that partly what I'm doing here with his aesthetic epistemology and social imagination explains why he would have held a view like that. So these aesthetic considerations, I would say that beauty for Du Bois is not metaphysical or ornamental. It's it's a deeply human-centered practice which is shaped by history, experience, and essential to both understanding and transformation. Aesthetic considerations are traditionally associated with the arts, play a crucial and often underappreciated role in scientific practice, especially as it pertains to theory selection and development. One major focus is the aesthetic qualities of scientific images and theories, scientific images or visualizations, which is what I refer to Du Bois as data portraits as, and I'll talk about how he and his team put these together. Um, they're making what was an invisible phenomena, racial injustice and the economic conditions around that, very real. And he organized these portraits as a kind of experience. Well, it's supposed to be an aesthetic experience, and I wish that I'd had them for you guys physically. They were reprinted in 2008 and re-edited by Whitney Battle Baptiste and Celius Munro, and they're so beautiful to see in person. They really are, and so I encourage you to buy the book. There was also a write up in Smithsonian Magazine about their release, but they're handmade. There are 63 of them, and they were accompanied by 500 photographs. Many of those photographs were collected while Du Bois was doing the groundwork for the Philadelphia Negro, which is the first social study on African Americans. So this comes a little bit after the Philadelphia Negro is published. The Philadelphia Negro, I just want to add, I was at the Du Bois Library at UMass most of the summer, and one of the things I discovered there is I got to look at who was soliciting data on African Americans. Does anyone know who had most interest? This is a pop quiz question now. Does anyone know who had the most interest in data on African American urban life, or why they might be interested in that data?
Yes, yeah.
Wait, who said that? That's nice try, Sonny, but no, it wasn't the FBI.
The FBI didn't exist.
The F-
Or else they would have, right?
Let's think more economic, guys. I'll give you a hint. Insurance companies. Yeah. So I was sort of looking through the letters where Du Bois is soliciting the US Census Department, and he's gathering health records. He's gathering all kinds of records. And all of that data gets sort of put together in this artistic form, in these data portraits. But I just wanted to emphasize this idea that I've been trying to kind of, I don't know, reconcile, which is that that the first study of African Americans had, it had economic interest driving it. Wanted to understand the death rates, mortality rates, crime, literacy, these things on African Americans. These are things that insurance companies use for well, all sorts of, I don't even get into that. But um anyways, the thing I'm trying to reconcile is thinking about that there are always political interests in the collection of data. And in our day and age, we understand how politicized data is. And Du Bois was one of the first Black data scientists. So it's driving the way I'm trying to think about, how Du Bois is thinking about art and its relationship to science already. And so you would think, well, the collection of data has nothing to do with aesthetic judgments, right? Why would a social scientist be interested in the way data is presented? But it's always been that way. So I'm gonna show you this is called the Georgia Negro. It's a map. It's the first plate in the out of the 63 data portraits, and it's a map. It's a global map. Maps are one way of displaying data. We'll talk about charts. There's different sorts of charts. We have bar charts. We have. I'm going to talk about. Which one is my favorite one? I'm going to talk about my favorite chart, which is a spiral chart that he creates, and some of the aesthetic influences of them. But I wanted to bring this up because this is called the Georgia Negro. And the first thing you should notice about it is that he's being very economical with his use of color, and this is very purposeful, especially if you compare it to the other portraits. But he's got a big idea, right? And that is he's emphasizing that the history of the transatlantic slave trade, right, has affected a global economy. And so it's not so much about the specificity here, right, that he's trying to make this point. And he gets solicited to come to Paris to present these portraits by a friend that he met at FIS Callaway. And he gets on a ship and in the cargo area of a ship to travel to Paris. So there was a big commitment there to going to present this research. But my point here is with this very first graph is that he wants to emphasize that there is an untold history about the importance of the transatlantic slave trade. And this graph is supposed to indicate that immediately. So it's the first thing you see when you look at the portraits. And that little star there, you won't be able to see it that well, but it is Georgia. Does anyone know why he might have put a star for Georgia?
Because it's where Emory is and where he was educated.
Did you go to Emory?
No, but I'm
I'm trying to figure out which Georgia you're asking about, the state or the country.
Good one. No, it's America. So yeah. The state of Georgia. It has the largest population of African Americans. And of course, if you look at the other places that are blackened on the global map, he's indicating that too, right? So that sets the tone already for what kind of things he was trying to do. Something is going on here with exemplification in particular, which is a aesthetic consideration. Maps. I got the opportunity to talk to a map maker about the way maps are made, but maps are made typically with some obvious kind of aesthetic considerations in mind, right? What is it that you want the viewer of your map to see immediately? In this case, I'm trying to point to Du Bois wanted to unearth a pretty large historical narrative about the influence of transatlantic slavery with this map. So the another theme I'm thinking about is the relationship between art and science. And so I was just talking about exemplification. I think the star and his choice of colors here indicates that. But these are aesthetic considerations for scientific thinking. And I'm not sure. Has anyone gone to the African American History and Culture Museum in DC? We probably should try to go before it gets shut down or something. It seems like that's where it's headed. But any kind of museum experiences, which Dewey would have talked about a lot, right? Um, I bring up the museum in DC because I've gotten to go and I haven't gotten to go. There's about 4 levels that you can go through, so it's more than one trip thing. But I did get to finish the bottom floor, which is about the history of slavery. And what I was impressed, I was admittedly, when it first opened, I'm thinking, well, I work on these things. I'm not really sure how much I'm going to learn from going to this museum, but I was not only wrong about uh, uh, all the other things I had to learn just from going there, but I was impressed by the fact that um, it was as accessible for a 5th grader as it was for me. So I just want to get you to think about what it would mean for not necessarily an artist to put these things together aesthetically, but a social scientist or a historian or a sociologist. And those are spaces where this kind of uh, information is displayed to us. Now, of course, you're probably thinking, there are all sorts of problems with that too, and of course, we can talk about that. But I want to move on. So uh, to think about science and art a little bit more. Many scientists, and I'm thinking in this case, particularly theoretical physicists, believe that beautiful theories, those that display qualities like simplicity, symmetry, and unity, are more likely to be true. So just this idea that we could have access of knowing or understanding to the world because of something aesthetically. We don't typically associate those things with science, but there's a lot of accounts in contemporary philosophy of science, albeit I was told this is a cottage industry interest that I have of the relationship between art and science. Not in a condescending way, just in a, yeah, kind of way. But these ideas about the role beauty plays in epistemology for science have been there forever. Du Bois praises Da Vinci partly because he thinks Da Vinci is the perfect scientific thinker because he's merged art and science together, and he was an inventor. So, so I wanted to draw that out, that there's always been this kind of attraction not only to beautiful aesthetic cultural objects, but even in theory selection, which theories are thought to perhaps be true, are thought to be beautiful, due to ideas like simplicity, symmetry. Those things typically are more important for physicists and mathematicians, whereas the romantic aesthetic, and I think we can add Du Bois in here, typically embrace more qualities like complexity, diversity, organic forms. And so we see these most clearly in discussions about biology or natural history. Um, and so the last thing I wanted to add, and each of these points I think are connections to how we might think about what Dewey has to say about social imagination, right? So this relationship between art and science, this idea of the kinds of aesthetic, scientific values, and then emotion is the third thing I want to have in terms of aesthetic experience. Um, Aesthetic judgments are viewed as a form of emotional response. And so there's increasing work to integrate cognitive emotional models around beliefs and emotions. And all of these are supposed to be thought to be very different components of scientific decision making. And I want to just zoom out here for a second and say that my interest in aesthetic judgment uh, comes if you are into philosophy of science and you're familiar with things like value freedom, epistemic democracy, and this idea that scientists aren't really the notion that a scientist would have any kind of aesthetic judgments is something that obviously gets pushed back. Now there are various different versions of value freedom. But my point here, and I think that Dewey and Du Bois would concur around this, is that aesthetic value judgments are certainly going to be important for the functioning of epistemic democracy. Now, the roles that we give social scientists and scientists versus artists, well, partly that's what I'm doing, trying to tell a narrative about those things. But the key thing to think about, I think, is that Dewey, as at least has helped me to bridge this gap in thinking about why Du Bois would have believed this to be true. And so I was mentioning art as experience, the idea that art is the primary means through which individuals refresh their perceptions of the world and become capable of envisioning new social possibilities. So everyday habits, narrow what we notice, but art breaks through this dullness, revealing meanings and relationships hidden in ordinary life by awakening perception. And that's why I was sort of calling attention to the museum experience. But with Du Bois's, now I've gotten it all mixed up. At Du Bois's exhibition, I'm totally blanking on how many people ended up seeing the exposition, but many people saw the exposition. It was actually, it traveled around a little bit after Du Bois left Paris, and it got critical acclaim in Europe. The media paid a lot of attention to it. It won an award. When it came to America and it had primarily a white audience, it did not. Um, and it just goes to show you how important, right, visibility is playing a function here, and why it is that he felt so compelled in the beginning to have to put together exposition like this. But revealing, right, the realities of Black life was what this exhibition was supposed to do. Now, outside of the graphs and the charts and things that I was mentioning, the photographs things like family budgets, pantries, these kinds of ordinary things. And what he's trying to reveal, right, is that to make visible to his audience, at least in Paris, right, that there was a developing nation of people, and the historical narratives that had been told and presumed about the racial prejudices were false. And to kind of just give this picture of Black American life, what it really is like. And that's why, the stuff on Dewey and social imagination really jumped out at me as a place of bringing them together. Because imagination for Dewey is not escapist. And I think there's a particular chart on, he has a number of charts on crime. And this was one of the important myths to dispel, right? This idea that African Americans were naturally prone to become criminals, without a story about poverty and segregation, and just the economic failures post emancipation era, Reconstruction, the failures of Reconstruction. Then if you just look at numbers on criminality in America, you don't have a context, right? Many of the myths about African Americans, and it's so important because these things were written in textbooks. The last chapter of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America is called The Propaganda of History. There, that term propaganda is coming up again, right? Because all of the lies that we're told were written in the history books. And of course, now we seem to never end this fight in this country about what is told about slavery in history books even to this day. So you could imagine how important it is, right, to think about, right, what are the avenues we have for revealing, right, the truth about African Americans? But it's not just a truth about African Americans. If you think about at least the metaphorical aspect of this map, right? This isn't just a local nationalist story about African Americans. It's a global story. It's an economic story. And the imagination, right? If you have contact, obviously, with these visualizations, that's one thing. But we're also talking about education here, and of course, that's important for Dewey. I'm gonna talk for a few more minutes, and then I'm gonna open it up to you guys. But oh, I can talk about my favorite chart. It's a spiral graph. And I'm bringing it up again because I guess I gave a version of this talk uh, about 6 months ago, and I was actually talking to high schoolers about it before I was sort of coming up with what kind of aesthetic considerations Du Bois was specifically using in different portraits. But this one, of course, attracted all of the students. And for obvious reasons, it doesn't look like the other ones, but it's called City and Rural Population 1890. And it's a little bit difficult to see the typography that Du Bois used when he put the exhibit together for the Paris Exposition. He used French typography, but it's that top bar is green. There's that little slight line there is blue. Then you have this yellow, and then you have the red. And around the bottom of the spiral, it says Negroes living in the country and the villages. And what else does it say? Negroes in cities refers to that little slight blue. The yellow is Negroes in cities from 2,500 to 5,000. And then at the top there, Negroes in cities of over 10,000 inhabitants. There's some other maps. He's got some maps of Georgia. Actually, I'll just show you the maps of Georgia. There's some Georgia maps there where he's looking at things by county, and then he has a national map where it looks at the populations of African Americans. But anyways, this particular graph is about migration. It's about migration, and it's about urban migration. Atlanta becomes a really important city for Du Bois. He ends up doing a lot of his sociological work in Atlanta, since you mentioned Emory. He worked at Atlanta University, though. Well, I'm trying to remember. What, well, I'm going to throw another popcorn question on. I'll give you guys the word to do. What do we think he's trying to say with this map? What immediately comes to mind now that we have a sense that it's about migration? Why a spiral?
The impression I'm getting is that the migration's going down from the top to the bottom. Although you said migration into the urban space, so that confuses me because it looks like a drain that the population is running down into a drain
Right.
and funneling in, even speeding up.
Kevin looks like
So, I mean, there's a lot of things I could say about this, but the first, just to piggyback on what Nick,
Yep.
Okay, what Nick said, is that the urban pieces are separating from what was otherwise a coherent swirl. So if there were no migration, it would all be red and it would just be a circle, just be a swirling circle. However, those other colored pieces are separating from the mass, right?
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the swirl means?
What do I think this world? Well, you have a relatively homogeneous population from which some folks are fleeing.
Mm-hmm. And there's something else I should say because I haven't really mentioned that, but interest in miscegenation is important too.
Oh, is that right?
There's
That's
there are some visualizations where Du Bois is dealing with miscegenation. They're kind of weird, but they're kind of weird. But this you made mention of what was the language you used there? Homogenous group, right? This question about racial homogeneity is obviously in the background, right? When we're talking about the history of African Americans, you're absolutely talking about a story about migration and miscegenation and what that would mean. So, when he's saying Negroes, who is he talking about? He is thinking, though, as you're pointing out, right, that rural population, the rural South, right, is the kind of home of African Americans if we're thinking about that global narrative, that little star, Georgia. Now, when I'm talking about urban and the stuff he says about Atlanta and why Atlanta becomes such an important city, and then we can talk even further about that historically, right? Other urban cities African Americans migrated to. My family migrated through Mississippi, Chicago, North Detroit, Michigan, that area. So there's that path of migration. Um, so he's thinking about migration and the part of that history. Yes, Danny.
I do want to point out that this idea of homogeneity, I think, is being challenged by the fact that it's a spiral. If Negroes, using that language, if African Americans during this time were truly homogenous, it would actually be a circle,
Mm-hmm.
not the spiral shape. So what we're seeing is actually a whole, what if it's migration north, we're actually seeing groups of communities traveling a la Underground Railroad, but this is the present day in 1890. So they don't have to travel by night, but they're traveling to the various communities that is their safe towns
Mm-hmm.
to get north.
And the other thing to say, since we are talking about migration, is that the choice not to migrate, the South is still primarily, even today, the place where African Americans are. So, yes, Harrison.
Something else I note is just the choice of color, because typically red represents danger of some kind, green represents prosperity. So it kind of seems as though there's an implication that people who are trapped in a rural circumstance might be socioeconomically locked in their circumstances. But by moving into the cities, there's opportunities for socioeconomic growth and social mobility. So it's almost, to me, it seems almost though as though it's encouraging urbanization as a means of kind of, I guess, advancing socially.
Yeah. This is a good time to bring up the Philadelphia Negro again because partly, this disturbing story of urban migration is partly what Du Bois is pointing out there, right? Is that the myth that moving to the city was going to bring better economic conditions due to at least more variety in terms of employment and occupation doesn't happen for African Americans, right? So when he's looking at Philadelphia, the communities walking through, he's like, no, there are just more people living in smaller spaces in urban dwellings, and so, uh, uh, yeah, this idea, right, that post emancipation reconstruction, that moving to the city was supposed to be part of how African American life was going to be restructured is a total lie. And there was another point out, you were pointing out the color. since we're talking about aesthetic judgments, yeah, the choice in color is right. There's a map. I'm sorry, it's not a map, it's a chart, and it's about slaves and freedmen. You can't see it so well, but he chooses to use the color green since you were talking about red and danger. He was attracted to using red for certain for in certain graphs, and this is the I Bob Gooding Williams just published a book called Democracy and Beauty. It was published by Columbia, and he just had a book launch in Berlin, and we talked about these portraits, but we were talking about the German war aesthetic that influence on Du Bois's some of his color choices, right? Some of the romantic stuff you see with the typography with Du Bois, but some of the choice in color is much more um what would I say? I've had some different verbs to describe adverbs to describe adjectives to describe his choice in color. And then there's times, quite frankly, in some of the maps, in particular, the maps with the Georgia counties, the colors he uses, there doesn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason to why he's not using any kind of principle in the color choice, which is interesting, right? Yeah. Yes. Fine.
Yes. What I got from the at least the graph and the spiral to me was like it seemed like part of it part of it seemed like a scaling issue, but like the other part is sort of like it's almost sort of like an exclamation point. Like even if we even if we spiral it still looks huge compared to the rest of the rest of the graph.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the thing, the spiral graph, the stuff it's pointing out about race relations and migration. I had a really long, actually, Danny, we've talked about this, but the north-south primacy in conversations in America about race completely leaves the West out. And that's certainly something it's a big concern. You could see why Du Bois is so concerned about the North and the South and the way he's constructing those ideas. But that continues to come to my mind when we're thinking about where do different communities and populations of America live today and the racial conditions they're living under. We are going to tell some story about migration. And that story, I think, would have to include discussions about the West. Someone else had their hand up, but I guess we've moved into a discussion. So,
So you just talking about the West. So when does places like California become so diverse? Like, I could just
oh, I was bringing up the West, not because I know very much about it. Only because I was I was having a long conversation about I was talking about Roy's because I had said earlier that I'd worked on the relationship between Du Bois and Josiah Royce. Royce from California, and thinking about the work that Royce did on race and the problems around that. So it just dawned on me. Maybe it's because I'm spending more time around people from that side of the country lately. And they're like, everyone always forgets about the West. And I'm like, that's so true.
I will say it's going to be closer to the 1910s when they're a lot more populous. During this time period, the West is going to be viewed as where all the radicals are, right? That this is around the time when Utah is kind of getting fought over by the Latter-day Saints, right? And the Latter-day Saints were still considered radical during this time period, not how they're imagined today. And many, And the race relations in the West are going to be very different from the race relations Du Bois is looking at. Though there are some African Americans out West because of the fact that there is less government oversight in the West, which means less possible intervention to fall into these economic traps.
Places like Oklahoma become important. Yeah.
Cowboys.
Yeah. Harrison.
Okay, sure. If you go back to the first slide with the main one, I just love seeing it all in its context.
Sorry.
Because when you first had that up,
Try not.
it very much looked like some of the works of Afrikaner that I've seen like the moment. And until you mentioned that it was data points, maybe I'm just far away, and I didn't even notice that it was actually data. I thought it was just pure art.
No, there is data.
Yeah.
And that's a funny thing because I haven't actually said much about the data that is on some of them. I think I was just mentioning those maps of Georgia. I was talking about the kind of lack of principle and color choice. But he's got the raw data, right? And if you ever get a chance to flip through the Philadelphia Negro, right, he's got the data there too. You know, you can look through it, the numbers he collected and things like that, and there's some indexes along with these things. But his choice of what data to present is an aesthetic choice. And I think that's where we get into this kind of this tension, right? Well, why would a social scientist be interested in putting this data over this data? And there are political reasons. Obviously, Du Bois had political reasons, but I think the maps indicate the. I should think about that a little bit more. I'm trying to think of all of them have data to some degree. With the exception of the map, the global map.
Well, even a map is still presenting data of some kind.
Yeah.
But what strikes me the most about this too is it's a direct challenge to this notion that this kind of myth, I would say, that data speaks for itself.
Mm-hmm.
And this general trend in the sciences of kind of stripping away the humanity and the context from all data and just presenting it as though it's this abstract, independent thing. And the justification for that is often, we need to get rid of aesthetics because it's an epistemic value, right? To corrupt our data in some way. But I think that fails to recognize that stripping the data of everything that makes it human is also an aesthetic judgment in itself.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of pointing that out that, you claim, these scientists claim that they're removing aesthetics, but they're actually just making an aesthetic judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of kind of problematic implications of that. Remove the humanity. I think especially in the social sciences, it's very important to note that data points are people, lives, and stories.
Yeah.
And especially this with it all together, I love as well because you can draw connections between them. You can see how they're related.
Mm-hmm.
And given that the very first one on the top left is
That's the map.
Yeah.
The global map.
that kind of contextualizes the history of all of that, where it's like without the transatlantic slave trade, none of this other data would have been possible.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a narrative going throughout
Yes,
as
yeah.
well. It really emphasizes, like you were saying, that like just crime statistics by itself doesn't really tell you anything.
Mm-hmm.
Situated.
Yeah. And I think and this is I guess the problem that we are dealing with, right? So going back to the museum, if we saw these hanging in a museum, we think about the fifth grader I was thinking about. Depending on what that student has learned in school or impressions that student's gotten in his or her community and so on and so forth, or what that student thinks they already know about these matters, we all come to these aesthetic pieces with some kind of understanding. And there's a problem, right, when there's obviously unequal understanding. And then there's sometimes just plain falsities that we have. So what do we do? And how, it's difficult to think about this as we're talking about knowledge, epistemology, and understanding, but every person is going to these things with their own sorts of background, knowledge, education of these things. And in some ways, the social scientist acting with aesthetic judgment is attempting to do some type of corrective, right? And that's why I think the I was bringing up the museum because for example, I know tons about Cucahuano. A fifth grader probably doesn't know as much about Cucahuano, but this idea that blacks had ideas about the evils of slavery, right? That's a powerful thing to see in a museum, right? And to be able to read these quotes. That also comes with some problems though, like you were just talking about, what did you say? Scaling issues, right? If we look at things like graphs and maps, right? Map makers and graph makers are always dealing with these things, right? The assumption that a graph, I mean, you guys are sitting pretty far away that that a graph is starting at 0, right? Or some of the graphs don't have keys, for example. Or some of the graphs are more defined than others, right? And so all of these things, I think, could lead us to believe that, and it might be an objection that at best the knowledge that could be taken away is going to be some kind of unequal knowledge, right? What's the big takeaway here? There's a lot of engineering, aesthetic engineering that goes into that, but it's so important because I think if we keep in mind this idea of the public and Dewey and social imagination, that we actually we come into contact. I mean, we're in a university setting, of course, so we come into contact with new information all of the time, but the average person comes into contact with some kind of data visualizations in various different ways pretty regularly, right? And some of them are created with not great intentions. If we want to go back to the point I was making about propaganda and art, as science, it can be used as propaganda. It often is. And so data activism is a term that Monroe assigns to these data portraits that Du Bois creates. And I think that's really powerful because it gets us to think about, right, what we think we understand and how it's being presented to us really requires us to understand that aesthetic judgments go into those things. And we all seem to care about science a lot. Yes.
Yeah. So it's time. It's good if I ask a question now.
Are you going to ask the hardest question with
No,
1
no.
minute left?
I need the moment also. No, so particularly the way that you question about the previous slide and also your reference to how the things are exposed in a museum and so on, that vehicles somehow also an idea or a mindset that wants to be communicated to the public, This is also very studied, for example, with the notion of exposition, Ausstellung, with one organized material, it wants to vehicle also an idea, sometimes. And I have the impression that you work with two connected but distinct concepts of aesthetics, because there is one that is the culture, and this is what you mentioned, the question of beauty, aesthetic judgment, so the fact that we somehow can have a value, we can have, we say good or bad, we make this kind of, and then there is this one that that are connected. I don't want to cut, but I want to distinguish. When you put the accent on the fact that in exposition you organize the material in a particular way, and so you vehicle something, or you ask about the previous slides, what does it mean for you? This figure, you refer implicitly to the notion of aesthetics that is active in Goodman, in my view, Nelson Goodman, but you find also in Dewey, in the 5th chapter of Art as Experience, and that's this idea that the work of art has two ways of communicating. One is what it says somehow, and one is what it exemplifies, what it possesses, The exemplification, it's also a way that the work of art communicates somehow, And I think that this aspect can be potentially very good also for connecting with Dewey, because Dewey makes there a big point in the chapter 5. He says there is an ambiguity here one thing is to think the work of art as a sign, as a symbol that refers to something else, as a representation. But then there is the possession, that while looking at the work of art, I have an experience, yeah? Then Goodman uses another vocabulary and he makes it more explicitly. He devotes an entire chapter in his language of art, but it's, I think, very connected to 2 points. And I think that this aspect, which has not to do with the value, has not to do with the value, it has to do with the cognition, has to do with the fact that we somehow can get some information about what the artists want to say just by seeing how the things are disposed or what is the presentation, of the things and so on, and not about what is said. And so I wanted to know if you are more attentive if you are interested to both aspects, or you were more interested to the value judgment, or also to the second one. So it was,
Yeah, there's, I guess, at the moment, the way I've organized the chapter is about thinking about this relationship between art and science. And then, as I was sort of talking about earlier, this idea of beauty sitting above truth and right. There's 3 ways to think about it. What was the first one? Right now, I've skipped to the beauty as meaning, and then I have beauty as cognitive ideal, and then beauty as political force and may. It sounds like what you're indicating is this idea that art and beauty are wrapped up as some kind of cognitive ideal. I'll look to see more specifically what you mean by Dewey and artist experience in that chapter.
the
But-
second page of chapter 5.
Do you have it right there?
Yeah, I looked, that's why I was looking to find the
Well, he's been working here, guys. He's a Dewey scholar. Okay, I'm gonna look at that. But yeah, the short answer is yes. I've been thinking about at least the concept of beauty as one of those 3 avenues as a cognitive ideal. But that has been more to do with like what's called fluency processing. I guess that's the way I guess the philosophers of science talk about this, but it'd be interesting to compare that to kind of what you're saying, these 2 ideas of the art possessing something and I guess the way we're interacting with it and what it's communicating and so on and so forth. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, my impression is that can be a very potential point to connect the way of working of Du Bois with Dewey.
And then I guess, this can be the last thing I say. It's getting back to that notion of truth that I began with.
That's why.
Yeah, if you could walk away with some kind of unified vision of knowledge, even with these 2 kinds of approaches that you're talking about, right? I do think you're a Dewey scholar, so you probably would know better with me, but my inclination already for Du Bois is one of the great things Du Bois says about philosophy is he calls it the science of sciences. And partly my book is trying to work out what he means by that, but as it applies to this aesthetic stuff, this idea that there is a unified that there is some kind of unified knowledge that we may or may not have we don't have complete access to it, but it kind of it unfolds to us and we engage with it through inquiry. Aesthetics is one avenue of that, and so that might be where these distinctions that you're talking about come up with the aesthetics stuff. But yeah, thank you.
Well, on that note, thanks everybody for coming again. Thanks for hosting Professor Brown at the Dewey Center, and thanks
Thank you.
Dr. Harris for giving us all this great things to think about. I have a lot I could say I know. Maybe I can catch you later.
Yes.
But yeah, that was really enjoyable. So thank you again.